Night stretched over a ridge of towers and distant mountains as the village slept beneath a scattering of stars. The scene shifted down into a misted clearing where the blonde girl found the kid seated on the ground. The pair stood framed by the pale wash of moonlight and drifting fog. As she called out, something watched from the shadowed trees. A pale, rounded face peered between branches, unseen at first but audible in its breath. The creature revealed itself as a skull-shaped head that spoke, its voice cutting through the stillness and drawing the blonde girl's stunned gaze. She answered with a terrified exclamation, declaring its nature aloud, and the voice's owner reacted in turn, surprised by its own exposure. The quiet clearing held a charged, incredulous pause as fear and astonishment met under the night sky. Night had already folded down over the clearing when the blonde girl suddenly shouted and brought a frantic quiet to the small group. The kid sat huddled on the ground while the skull-shaped presence, the talking skeleton, spoke, calling attention to what it had been observing and challenging the strange circumstance between them. The blonde girl and the skeleton traded questions and startled responses. She demanded to know who it was, it probed her identity, and suggested there was purpose to its appearance. Their banter shifted from alarm to a wary, almost bemused curiosity as she tried to explain herself. Without warning, the skeleton asserted a role in the scene, neither wholly hostile nor simply benign, and a purple-tinted phenomenon unfolded around them, altering the light and startling everyone in the clearing. The moment left the trio poised between revelation and danger as the night tightened its hold. Night still cloaked the clearing as the talking skeleton and the blonde girl traded sharp, urgent words over the motionless kid. The skeleton, at first amused and frank about its boredom with the endless cycle of deaths, punctuated the exchange with a derisive laugh that unsettled the girl and shifted the tone from pleading to bargaining. The blonde girl implored the skeleton to intervene, her voice small and insistent against the creature's world-weariness, and the skeleton feigned surprise before conceding, its motives ambiguous, its patience thin. As a purple-tinged haze threaded the air again, the creature moved to the child's side, gathered the limp form, and set off across the bleak landscape. Dawn broke over the scene while the skeleton walked away carrying the kid, leaving the clearing emptied of its desperate congregation and ringing with the strange mixture of hope and dread the night had borne. After the long night and the walk that carried them from the clearing, the talking skeleton erupted into a ragged training session, shouting and demonstrating with theatrical gusto as the kid staggered through basic movements. The skeleton barked orders to hurry back and drill the fundamentals until sunset, alternately impatient and oddly solicitous as it forced repetition and teased the child. In the brief pauses between commands, the kid's voice turned inward. He admitted, almost to himself, that his parents had died, and that memory landed heavy in the open air. The confession prompted a rare silence from the skeleton, then hardened into resolve in the kid's stance. He gripped his practiced sword, affirmed that he must become strong, and began again with renewed purpose. The blonde girl stood nearby, watching the ritual of instruction and resolve unfold, the scene balancing harsh instruction with a fragile, growing hope. After the earlier, ragged drills with the kid, the talking skeleton paused and exhaled. The brief silence carried weight before he offered to teach the blonde girl as well. She lit up at the offer, asking in wonder and then bursting into cheerful thanks, full of eager motion. He led her through basic steps at the edge of the clearing while she stumbled, laughed, and kept trying, her small efforts scattering hope across the grass. As the sun slanted, the skeleton stopped to watch, feeling both burden and strange fondness settle over him. He tested a patient certainty that what mattered now was steady repetition rather than harsh command. He allowed himself a quiet plan to teach her not to rely on him, but to find her own balance, and then lay back on the earth, eyes on the trees, determined to see the progress take root. After their ragged drills, the talking skeleton and the blonde girl resumed practice with the same earnest rhythm. She lunged, stumbled, and laughed while he parried and guided her. When the pair paused beneath the big tree, the skeleton tested a different lesson, conjuring crackling purple shapes that coalesced into snarling, spectral beasts and streaked toward the tree line, startling them both. He braced himself as the phantoms tore off into the forest, then recovered enough to offer the blonde girl a steadying, encouraging gesture. She accepted it with bright relief. A cloaked traveler carrying a staff approached, exchanging a quiet moment with the skeleton and the child, and the scene shifted from demonstration to company. A sudden collapse or fainting startled the group briefly, but it dissolved into easy laughter and concern. By dusk, the three, talking skeleton, blonde girl, and kid, with the traveler nearby, lay back against the roots and watched the trees, the day ending in shared quiet and gentle resolve. A palm lay splayed on the earth in a tight, exposed close-up, darkened at the edges and still against the ground. Not far from it, two figures sat back-to-back beneath the open sky, shoulders easing with a brief calm as dusk lingered. The traveler and the blonde girl shared a quiet, steady rest. The silence was cut by a jagged sound, a mark of action, and the mood snapped taut. The blonde girl sprang up, seizing a long blade and driving forward in a wide, determined arc, her motion blurred with speed as she committed to the strike. Across from her, the skeletal form answered instantly, the clash of weapon and bone meeting in a flurry of parries and counterblows. Steel flashed, momentum traded hands, and the tranquil pause dissolved into the raw, practiced violence of a sparring exchange watched over by the nearby traveler. The brief calm shattered as the blonde girl surged forward, and the sparring resumed with razor focus. She drove a broad, committed arc that met the talking skeleton's mirrored parries and counters. Their exchange climbed and folded, overhead strikes, spinning footwork, and a charging leap, each blow traded with practiced speed until the blonde girl found a moment of air above her opponent. A close viewpoint lingered on her face as she grinned through the exertion, while the skeleton's blank expression held steady beneath its helm, as if cataloging each motion. The combat paneling then eased away from the clash. A title card severed the action, and the mood opened into silence. In a single, quiet cut, the story landed at a sunlit lake. The traveler stood at the tree line, a small, hesitant murmur curling into the still air as the scene resolved from heat to hush. A close-up showed the blonde girl murmuring, "Master," with a soft, half-smile, and she immediately surged from the water, promising to help at once as sea spray glittered around her. A small pack smoldered nearby, its orange flare a sharp punctuation, before the perspective pulled back to a shaded clearing where the traveler lingered by the tree line and the trio settled to speak. The talking skeleton grew quiet and puzzled at a whispered remark, then asked aloud what was being told to the child. The blonde leaned in and began to recount the place where she once lived. The mood dimmed as the skeleton relayed what he'd heard, that the village had been abandoned, the farms left to rot, and that people had largely given up hope, leaving the clearing heavy with resignation. In the final beat, the blonde girl looked to her master, and against the quiet, allowed a small, admiring admission about how strong he had become. The clearing's low light held them as the talking skeleton turned the conversation inward, asking the blonde girl plainly if she planned to become a hero. She started at the question, then listened as he recounted years of teaching and a story about a friend who had wanted only to help people. He explained that despite doubts and derision from others, the lesson remained simple. One did not need titles or qualifications to save people. Framing himself as a keeper of a northern tradition and its techniques, he named her successor in that line and, in a deliberate, ceremonial motion, produced a small dagger. He presented it to her as both heirloom and responsibility, imploring her to draw the blade with pure intentions. The girl absorbed the weight of the gift, surprised but quietly receptive, the moment folding into a solemn, hopeful promise between master and pupil. The talking skeleton presented the small dagger to the blonde girl and with a quiet ceremoniousness told her to go and save the world, then come back. She took the blade, felt its weight, and he added, "I will always be here waiting for you." After that exchange, she rose and began to leave the clearing. The talking skeleton remained beneath the trees and watched her go, his hand raised in a parting gesture that matched his promise. She moved into the wood, first walking, then breaking into a run along the sun-dappled path, cloak and hair trailing as the distance opened between them. The talking skeleton stayed where he had stood, steady and patient, the scene closing on her receding figure, and the sense of a duty passed on her departure marked by resolve, his by a lingering watchfulness. He settled into the dark and told himself he only had to wait, the hush around him folding into patient thought. Memories of the brief meeting lingered. It had been short, but the echo of that connection made the solitude easier this time, as he sat with the wrapped blade and the steady black of the evening. A soft voice broke the hush by asking if he had gotten lost, and a second figure demurred at being called Master, the exchange light with familiar teasing rather than formality. Steps in sunlight announced another arrival. The blonde girl emerged back into the clearing and offered a simple, bright greeting. The waiting had reached its purpose. The figures met again with a mixture of relief, gentle correction, and the quiet understanding that whatever duties lay ahead would be faced together. A pale skull had watched from above as the clearing settled around them, and the blonde girl stepped back into the light with a grin that cracked the hush. She dropped down beside the figure and burst into delighted laughter, calling out to Kid as she replayed the adventure in quick, vivid sentences. She said it had been a really wonderful trip, that they had seen worse and more than she ever imagined, that there had been many monsters, and that it had been truly awful in places, but that she had also helped people along the way using what she had been taught. Her voice softened into gratitude as she credited her companion for those lessons, then leaned in close in a small, intimate motion that let the moment close on warmth. The clearing held the two of them there, laughter fading into a gentle, shared stillness. After their laughter and quiet gratitude, the blonde girl closed the distance and folded herself around Kid in a brief, earnest embrace, murmuring apology and a desire to know the other's story. She pressed her hands to the child's back in a rough, comforting motion and invited Kid to speak, but the child faltered, shrinking inward and then sitting apart on the ground, small and uncertain. Above them, the pale skull watched from the shadows. Its empty socket lingered like a weight on the clearing. The gaze deepened until the skull's eye became a bleeding black void pierced by a single purple point, an unnatural focus that swallowed the fragile warmth between the two. The intimate moment frayed as the presence observed, leaving the pair suspended between human tenderness and a sudden, encroaching menace. After the skull's stare had turned the clearing cold and fragile warmth had been left behind, the viewpoint snapped outward to a band of armored men moving through the trees. Their leader scanned the scene, and the group faltered at the sight of a roped, cruciform figure and an unnatural black-purple maw forming above the clearing, emblazoned with the words "The Mountain." A voice spilled from that void, taunting them with a question that hollowed the air, and the skull they had glimpsed stepped forth. The talking skeleton revealed a blazing purple eye as its presence answered the intruders. Before the soldiers could steady themselves, the skeletal power lashed out. One man was struck down and a spray of blood and bodies recoiled, the cohort left shaken and exposed beneath the malignant name that pulsed over them. After the initial shock of the clearing and the naming of the mountain had left the soldiers reeling, the talking skeleton began to speak, and the scene folded into a memory. He recounted a time 10 years earlier, painting images of slaughter and dismembered bodies, and how he had answered their voices, raised their limbs, and bound them into service. Grotesque, purple-eyed forms and horned shapes swelled around his tail, giving his words a living, writhing proof. He said that from those dark acts, he learned to command the dead, and that he had been tied to this place ever since, a guardian made of bone and grief. The soldiers' fear sharpened into discipline at a shout. The armored leader barked orders, and the cohort scrambled to steady themselves and form up beneath the malign spectacle. After the memory of slaughter and the skeleton's confession left the soldiers rigid, the armored leader challenged the limits of such dark craft with a bitter question. The skeletal speaker answered with a cold promise to wait, and a close-up of the knight's visor registered disbelief before the earth answered him. A tide of purple-lit skulls and corpses rose like a living sea, filling the clearing with an impossible army the soldiers could scarcely comprehend. From the gloom, a hooded stranger stood silent, eyes unseen beneath the cowl, as necromancy stitched the dead into ranks and monstrous mounts led the charge. The knight demanded the invoker's identity, but his shout was swallowed by a sudden crimson eruption that slammed into the front lines and hurled the armored leader back, leaving the cohort stunned and the newly risen horde poised to advance. The scene began with a falling cloak and a hovering, taunting question, "You ask who I am," as the hooded presence that had watched from the gloom stepped into voice. He revealed himself in a voice that demanded ownership of the battlefield. "I am the mouth of the Empire, the voice of the Empire," and then raised his great blade as a purple-black energy welled and speared skyward. Light flared from the figure and struck the soil with apocalyptic force. The ground shuddered and split in a radial pattern as shock and debris hurled outward. The armored leader and his troops were thrown into chaos, the clearing rent by a craterous impact, while the newly named mouth of the Empire stood amid the dust and ruin, his proclamation answered by the land itself. A black, heralding voice addressed the populace as the messenger spoke, demanding that the people of the Empire heed his words. In a quiet dwelling, a lone watcher peered from a crooked window and whispered, bewildered, asking what in the world was happening as the sky turned blood-red and lightning split the air. The land itself answered. Thunder and apocalyptic energy ripped up soil and bone, and where the blast fell a spreading tide of cadaverous shapes and glowing, pupil-like orbs aligned into serried ranks. From that surge the mouth of the Empire's intent became clear. If the Empire had strayed from its founder's will, the messenger would grant mortal rulers the strength to set it back on course, and the assembled host stood ready beneath the jagged horizon, a dark promise made manifest. Above a wasteland torn open by the earlier summons, the mouth of the Empire stood motionless on a mound of skulls and scattered bones, while storm-dark clouds streaked crimson overhead. The earth beneath him had split into glowing wounds, rivers of molten rock cutting through the ruined soil as arcane sigils and jagged stakes marked the field. The scene suggested not only conquest but ritual reclamation. Silence settled for a breath, then the mouth addressed his vanquished realm with a voice that sounded like wind through hollow bone, calling the ruined country his old homeland and invoking ancient grievances. The camera closed on his face, a white skull framed by a dark, feathered mantle, and his words hardened into judgment. The homeland would be made to suffer and atone. The assembled ruin and the herald's proclamation left no doubt that retribution, methodical and absolute, had been set in motion. After the mouth of the Empire's proclamation over a ravaged land, the scene cut to a quiet stretch of grass, where a small, writhing form disturbed the sod, and the camera pulled back to reveal the village beneath a burning, crimson sky. Villagers and a handful of armored figures stood on the horizon as distant shapes moved against the ruined skyline, tension mounted as observers strained toward the south. A sudden swell of shadow and red light birthed a roiling mass of purple-tinged undead that spilled forward in layered, nightmarish shapes, the undead horde now visible on the southern outskirts. Alarmed voices raised the alarm, and a close-up on a leader's wide, determined eye punctuated the crisis as orders were barked. Every standby squad must assemble immediately. The cut closed on the villagers bracing for the oncoming wave as forces prepared to meet the advancing horde. After the prior proclamation and the villagers' tense vigil, an armored figure produced a pulsing purple device and set it in motion. With a sudden boom, the artifact erupted, flaring an orange, fiery shock that washed over the nearby fields. In the wake of the blast, a rolling mass of purple energy coalesced into monstrous mounts and skeletal riders that swept across the burning skyline, flinging shapes into the air and turning the horizon into a churning tide of corpses. The invasion revealed itself not as scattered horrors, but as a formed army of writhing, purple-tinged undead that thundered toward the settlement, darkening the sky with motion and sound. Observers watched in growing dread as the creatures advanced in ranks, and a silhouetted leader bellowed an urgent command for everyone to fall back, the last clear human order before the horde surged onward. An armored figure lunged across a scarlet-streaked ground, the silhouette cutting a violent arc as he closed on the oncoming threat. Close shots caught a sharpened glare before the attacker telegraphed a single, brutal motion. A prowling strike labeled the wolf fang technique that erupted with purple light and cleaved through the writhing undead at his feet. Bodies and spectral energy fanned outward beneath the sweep, leaving a stunned, smoky space in the wake of the blow. As the field settled, a different panel shifted perspective. an observing man spoke aloud about a wilderness stronghold being used to raise an army, and captions placed the scene earlier in time before the Empire's full storm. The sequence closed on the armored silhouette standing amid red wind and settling ash, the immediate threat pushed back even as larger dangers loomed beyond the frame. The armored figure, having swept aside lesser threats, peered through the crimson haze and declared his quarry, the necromancer. A close-up revealed the sorcerer's warped visage, and a caption bluntly named him, a palm of glowing purple rose to seize the scene, and the comic cut to a caption that explained the necromancer's command over an undead army. The necromancer's magic coalesced into brutish purple forms that surged forward as the armored man prepared to finish the job. His motion was met by a precise, brutal strike that cleaved across his throat, blood and shock blooming in the red air. The ground boiled with newly animated hulks, and a towering, monstrous corpse strode into view, roaring its arrival. The sequence closed on the wounded fighter's anguished face and the relentless advance of the necromancer's forces, the brief advantage shattered and the larger threat fully revealed. The page opened on the necromancer's power, brutish, purple spirits coalesced and surged outward as warped figures stalked the scarlet sky. A caption named the technique, and the scene tightened to a chilling close-up of a skull-like face with glowing purple eyes, while a thought or whisper confessed that a slash only impeded a limb from an irreversible angle. The skull then voiced a single, hollow accusation, "Was it you?" and the camera snapped back to show a cloaked silhouette leaping from the heavens, cobra-like purple energy flaring around the strike as it aimed down at the town. Rooftops and streets blurred beneath the descending figure. The final frames emphasized the distance fallen and the ominous intent of the attack, leaving the question of who had struck and who now answered unresolved as the undead power gathered below. A cavernous skull filled the first frame, its single purple eye burning like a summoned accusation, and a hollow whisper pressed at the edges of the scene. The view cut to a lone, sword-bearing man bracing on a rooftop as the town's timbered roofs receded beneath him. From the heavens, a hooded, cobra-like silhouette dove, purple energy streaking the air, and the descending force blurred the distance between attacker and ground. The two met in a violent collision of steel and sorcery. A jagged purple slash ripped across the swordsman's body as he staggered, then grimly answered with a blade-for-blade parry. Between furious strikes, a tiny skull-masked presence flitted at the edge of combat, while the red sky seemed to swell with necromantic hunger. The undead power that had coalesced below pressed upward, as if smelling the blood of the living. The sequence closed on the combatants locked in desperate momentum, the town suspended under their furious, uncertain duel. The clash continued without mercy. The armored Sir Knight met a series of angled slashes and stepped back as the attacking figure kept the pressure relentless. He faltered, briefly caught by a blow, and grimaced while the opponent, a small, skull-masked presence that darted like a viper, hammered the assault home with savage intent. Blows landed in quick succession, metal rang against bone and cloth, and the skull-masked fighter followed a sweeping strike with a sudden, detonating burst that threw up dust and sparks. Sir Knight braced and attempted to answer, but the explosives rocked him, sending him crashing toward the earth as the attacker seized the moment. The sequence ended on harsh, staccato impacts and a lingering close-up of the skull's empty gaze, the grin frozen as the battlefield rained debris and the duel's momentum teetered between ruin and resolve. After the violent exchange that sent armor and dust flying, the scene tightened to two figures in the aftermath. Footsteps drew nearer as the wounded Sir Knight steadied himself and spat blood, forcing out a hoarse, halting accusation that the other had returned. The skull-masked assailant paused, answered with a rasp, and then, in plain words, identified itself as a revenant. The revenant and the knight traded clipped questions and bitter observations. The revenant mocked the notion of remembered faces after so much slaughter, and suggested it could not be expected to recognize those it had once fought among, while the knight's hurt and confusion flickered across his scarred features. The exchange left the battlefield tense and unresolved. No clean confession or reconciliation came, only the revenant's hollow admission and a final, wordless withdrawal as the ruined street closed around their silence. The battered quiet that had settled over the ruined street broke with a single, sharp interruption. The revenant lunged back into speech, slashing the silence with a shouted "Hey!" The knight flinched as an unrestrained attack landed, a blade and blood flashing together, and his startled cry filled the air. The revenant did not celebrate. Instead, it spat a cold rebuke, questioning the pride taken in slaughter and dismissing the victims as merely imperial citizens sacrificed for hollow gain. Its voice narrowed to contempt as it derided the pursuit of that power as worthless, each phrase carving deeper at the knight's resolve. In the final, cruel twist, the revenant reached for something more intimate, invoking a child, naming them the hero's child, and left that accusation to hang like smoke over their ruined ground, sharpening the sense of betrayal and loss as both combatants reeled from the words and wounds. Sir Knight staggered as the moment snapped open. A single, wild strike had driven him back, the close-up of a dilated eye and a blood-smeared blade making the violence visceral. The assailant, driven and relentless, swept through the ruined ground, sending bodies tumbling and leaving weapons embedded in the cobbles, and the field became a raw tableau of slaughter and ruin. Over the carnage, the attacker voiced a brutal creed, insisting the killing had been for the greater glory of the Empire, and calling it a necessary death, each line landing like another blow. That justification did not pass unchallenged. A skull-faced figure rose amid the wreckage, and with a quiet, collapsing disbelief, dismissed the claim. The skeleton cut the space with a single syllable of refusal, and then, odd and faint against the red-smeared sky, began to speak an apology that bent the moment into something more complicated than mere triumph or vengeance. The talking skeleton cut into the moment with a single, resolute line of refusal as a brilliant blue column of light split the sky and struck the mountain, carving a wound of radiance into stone. The beam's afterglow lingered on the skeletal face, which registered a shocked, silent beat as energy cascaded downward toward the valley and the town beneath. From the rooftop silhouette, Sir Knight watching, the strike read like a verdict. The city's skyline was briefly pierced by the remnant of that light. Deep under the impact site, machinery activated. Floating cubes and interlocking conduits hummed, confirmations scrolled over core circuitry, and an annunciator pronounced the main battery successfully connected. Behind iron bars in a dim chamber, bound figures pressed at the prison as the facility completed its sequence, the knight suddenly alive with a harsh, clinical power that changed the scale of the threat in an instant. After the facility's systems reported readiness, a grinning operator announced the mission complete and issued the order to activate the anti-undead barrier. A focused flare of light struck the mountain, and then, as commanded, a cross-shaped focal point erupted across the plain. A translucent turquoise dome swelled upward and rippled outward in concentric waves as the barrier took form. The field's air shimmered and heaved with kinetic force, and from that disturbance, strange violet figures with oversized, pupil-less eyes coalesced into bodies, an approaching manifestation of the undead horde. The creatures surged forward beneath the new sky-colored shield, while ranks of armored soldiers braced themselves at the boundary, spears and standards raised against the oncoming shapes. The scene closed on a tense standoff, a freshly erected defensive miracle meeting an immediate, ugly counter, machines and men holding fast as the purple forms closed the distance. As the skirmish settled, a panicked shout declared that the attacking creatures were disappearing, and another voice confirmed that the undead army had been wiped out. A figure reflected on the composition and origin of the phenomenon, saying it had been crafted long ago and praised as the strongest in living memory. The mood tightened as one speaker warned that even the survivor would not last long in that place. The survivor replied with quiet acceptance. Conversation turned inward, noting a strange craftsmanship tied to the name of the device and hinting at larger makers behind it. A colder, pragmatic voice dismissed sentimentality. Brains did not matter. They could simply raise another army, and then raised the unsettling idea that those who would stand above them were already created by people who had exploited the citizens. The final panels left the question of culpability and fate lingering in the air. A shadowed visage loomed in the gloom before giving way to a luminous skeletal outline that spoke of retribution. The figure's voice promised that others would join me for the sake of vengeance. The scene then shifted to a pulsing speech bubble that amplified the warning. Those forces would unite, expected together with them, and the camera closed on the speaker's hollow skull and violet eyes, which burned with intent. The speaker, the Revenant, framed the threat as inevitable and sweeping, announcing a singular objective: to bring the Empire to its end. No counterargument or reply was shown. The panels lingered on the Revenant's determined expression and the spreading shadow, leaving the declaration and its ominous promise as the final impression. After the Revenant's earlier vow of sweeping vengeance hung in the air, a different scene recalled what had been lost. A small band that had once hated war moved together, their armor and colors bright against the pale background. They came before a crowd, and the armored leader lifted a sword aloft as cheers rose, an image of ceremony and purpose that the narrator thought belonged to a past they had hoped was over. The moment splintered, glass or memory fractured across the panels, images tearing into shards that scattered the procession's triumph into jagged pieces. A single silhouette walked away along a ridge while fractured portraits of comrades stared from the broken panes, each face overlaid with the same question: had all their fighting yielded this hollow future? The sequence closed on that reluctant doubt, the celebration reduced to shards, and an aching reevaluation of why they had ever stood together. After the earlier vow and the fractured memories of a once-united band, the kid moved forward alone across an empty, wind-blurred plain. He stopped beneath an indifferent sky and admitted he did not know the next step, each question a small echo. With what heart did his past self still go to the battlefield, and for whom had those fights been fought? His gait and the widening horizon framed the absence of comrades, and the emptiness of an era without them pressed on him. Footsteps marked sand that belonged to no procession. His silhouette climbed to a narrow height and held against the distance, asking aloud where he should go now that the old purposes no longer answered. The scene folded those doubts into the landscape, leaving the kid isolated on a spire of wind and sky as the final, unresolved question hung between him and whatever lay beyond the haze. Leaving the windswept height behind, the kid found himself in a compact, snow-ringed northern village and made his way into the low-ceilinged hall of the Adventurers Guild. He approached a table, voice thin with practical need, and explained he had been following the road north and become lost. From his cloak he produced a creased map and asked simply to be shown the way. A short silence met him, then a curt rebuke that the guild was not the neighborhood information center, cut across the room and exposed the strangeliness of his request. One patron stared without speaking, another scowled and labeled the intrusion shameless, while the kid offered to leave quietly if only someone would point him onward. The exchange left the question unresolved. He had traded a solitary spire for a busiest room of strangers, but not yet for a guide. Seated at a low table in the guild hall, the kid listened as a rough patron, eliciting the room's attention, remarked that the wandering child reeked of blood and was otherwise strange. A hooded shadowed figure remained wordless in the doorway while the patron elaborated on a grim rumor. Beyond the mountain range, in a place called Chanton Village, a necromancer had supposedly slaughtered knights and overran the settlement. The mention of that name tightened the kid's expression until, in a close, almost private moment, he wondered if the rumor could be true. Before any answer could form, the scene erupted. The table and its occupants were rocked by a sudden, blinding impact from an unseen strike that splintered the space and threw the conversation into chaos. After the table's shattering impact had cut the conversation short, a dark-haired stranger stepped forward and revealed bluntly that the crowd had been speaking about someone in the room. The revelation was met with an immediate, furious response. The talking skeleton rose with a single, high-contrast cry, "Undead," and fixed a glowing eye on the intruders. It spat contempt at the threat, taunting whoever had dared pick a fight, and then hurled its power outward without warning. The hall detonated under that force. Boards exploded, dust and splinters filled the air, and patrons were hurled across the room as a devastating shockwave carved a scar through the space. Amid the chaos, the kid and the other occupants were overwhelmed by the sudden onslaught, forced to scramble for footing as the talking skeleton's assault left the guild hall in ruins. As dust and splinters still hung in the air, the dark-haired stranger stepped through the haze and peered at the shattered floor where a prone figure lay in a new fissure. The talking skeleton emerged from the drifting smoke to survey the scene, and the stranger coldly noted that their presence must have been read. The element of surprise was lost. With a resigned calculation, he announced that the failure warranted decisive action and barked the command to kill the intruder. Two assailants dove through the breach toward the figure below in a blur of motion, but the skeleton's voice cut through the chaos with a dry, incredulous rebuke about only wanting directions. Its eye flared unnatural light as it clenched a fist, and with a sudden, dark finality, it declared that from this moment forward, the intruders would bear the blame for what came next. Acting on the dark man's command to kill the intruder, one assailant launched himself through the shattered rafters and dove toward the figure below with a blade raised. He closed the distance in a blur and screamed "Die" as his swing slashed toward the talking skeleton, but the blow was not the final word. A spray of explosive impacts erupted across the attacker's chest and shoulders, staggering him. In a swift, unnatural counterattack, the talking skeleton's eyes suddenly flared and released a narrow, purple beam that pierced the space between them and struck the assailant full in the face and torso, driving him back beneath a hail of energy and debris. The room filled with the sound and sight of furious impacts as the intruder's assault collapsed into a desperate, pummeling reckoning. After the talking skeleton's sudden, purple counterattack sent the first assailant reeling beneath a spray of debris, the room devolved into brutal, immediate combat. The staggered attacker crashed to the ground as fragments detonated around him, and the kid sprinted through the ruin toward the center of the fight. A second fighter vaulted into the opening with a raw, shouted charge, swinging a blade that met an answering strike in a shower of sparks and shock. Steel and bodies collided, launching both combatants across the floor while concussive impacts rippled through the space. In the tangled aftermath, a rapid grapple produced a flash of metal at someone's throat. The chaos froze on a close-up of the captive's sweating face and the knife's point, the outcome hanging precariously as every participant braced for the next decisive move. Following the knife-edge standoff, the talking skeleton seized his attacker by the throat and used sheer force to hurl him backward, the impact detonating a shower of debris as the man crumpled across the floor. The skeleton moved away from the shattered grapple site, stepping through smoke and falling masonry with an unhurried gait while the kid slipped in among the ruins. He paused beneath the arena-like rafters and scanned the space, his skull face set against drifting dust. From that vantage, two cloaked figures emerged into view. The skeleton turned toward them, blank eyes fixed. The nearest stranger readied himself, and in an instant, a violent burst of force erupted between the combatants. Light and fragments blossomed outward, so the moment closed on a sudden, jagged impact that split the ruined air and left the next outcome unresolved. The aftermath of the sudden, destructive collision left dust and rubble drifting across the arena floor until a fresh impact rent the scene. A skull-faced, feral shape slammed down and gouged the earth, sending waves of dust and heat outward. From the smoke, a lone man approached the scarred center and peered at the settling wreckage, voice low as he wondered if whatever he sought had vanished. Before he could turn, a bruising, purple shadow pooled at his shoulder, brief and sinister, and the small, skull-headed beast reappeared with a savage charge. The man braced, slid into position, and met the creature's attack with a swift counterstride. Their exchange snapped like wire, eyes locked in a tense, wordless duel as the scene braced for the next strike. After the earlier, violent impact scarred the arena floor, the dark-haired stranger watched warily as a small, feral, skull-headed creature crashed down nearby and gouged the earth. He blinked in confusion as the beast whipped back into motion, the shockwave of its landing throwing up a curtain of dust and ash. Close-ups of his face showed sudden alarm. When the smoke settled, the center was empty, and the man peered across the rubble, muttering a question about disappearance, a thin sheen of tension in his posture. A bruising purple shadow pulsed at his shoulder, unnoticed until the creature re-emerged and charged from the flank. The stranger tightened his grip, pivoted, and answered the assault with a clean, practiced strike. Their clash was sharp and wordless, eyes locking in a taut instant before the next exchange unfolded. After the earlier clash and the dust settled around the cratered floor, the skull-headed creature reared and fixed the dark-haired stranger with a sudden, wide-rimmed stare. Its single exposed eye flared like an alarm. The man tightened his grip and moved with economy, sending a bright blade toward the creature's right as a clean, convincing thrust. The beast reacted to that opening, but the motion was a deliberate lure, a feint, and the stranger's face and body shifted mid-assault. With a quick verbal cue and a redirected step, he abandoned the right-side feint and committed the momentum elsewhere. The real cutting edge came from the opposite line. The follow-through was violent and precise, the sword finding a new path through the space the feint had created and striking before the creature could fully recover, the exchange resolving in a single, sharp instant. A sharp intake of breath and a startled close-up preceded the violence, and the skull beast's motion slammed into the scene. Debris and a shockwave threw a man back into a crater of falling stone. Two soldiers stared, disbelief written across their faces as one breathed. "It can't be." The camera cut to the fallen leader, the Sir Knight half-buried, bloodied, and the whispered, appalled caption noted that the captain had been felled in a single blow. Dust settled like a curtain as the field held its breath. From the haze, a hooded figure stood with deliberate calm, while a second cloaked speaker half-announced, "Next is," and a nearby onlooker hissed in unease. In the final beat, the perspective swung to an impossible silhouette, a shrouded void figure whose head was a black spherical absence. It turned and asked, "Who are you?" leaving the soldiers' shock and the newcomer's threat hanging in the smoke. A terse proclamation, "That's enough," rang out, and the camera lingered on a hollow-eyed skull before drawing back to a balcony where a blond man peered down at the courtyard. From his vantage, he implored the crowd to stop, saying he could give them what they wanted, while figures below shifted and murmured, one trailing the unfinished thought. The way. The tension snapped as someone below shouted, "Guild Master." The blonde descended from authority into formal cordiality, welcoming the newcomers to the northernmost adventurers' guild of the Empire, introducing himself as Tor Vinland and offering a private room to speak. The scene closed on his composed, smiling face as the crowd's agitation met his calm invitation, leaving the promise of negotiation to follow, and the assembled onlookers uncertain whether the arrival would diffuse or deepen the confrontation. Tor Vinland retreated to his office and outlined the rumor, a skeleton said to dwell in the back region of the continent, a claim that had prompted a formal request and several search parties. He framed it as the sort of old tale his adventurers knew well, then explained that a reward had been offered to any party that could confirm the truth.